Listen. Listen closely, and I will tell of a legend, one of the oldest in all of our knowing. It is from a time so remote that the bright stars in the dark velvet-rich night sky ache for a time before that time to return. They remember what went before it, with a fondness that brings a distant longing to their hearts and a pain for which they know there is no cure. Now, in the tranquillity of the summer and the cold, comfortless winter, the stars listen to the bleak laments from some far-off worlds, and their hearts ache. Their hearts break to return to a time when there was nothing but silence in the air, and they would have a smile upon their lips and a happiness and joy in their hearts. In what seems like so many lifetimes before, unstoppable curiosity filled their minds when they first heard the low, deep moaning in the night. They had intrigue wrap her relentless, mischievous fingers about their minds as they tried to sleep, as they tried to rest. But it fascinated and repulsed them at one and the same time to hear someone or something suffering. Suffering so much that it caused them to lament and wail to the heavens. Night followed restless, disturbed night, and it had lasted through 100,000 human lifetimes, and still it would not stop. Whether you are a star, a god, or a human, those things that you try to ignore only become more fascinating and compulsive the more you try to put them from your mind. And so it was with the stars. The song seemed to come from all parts of the universe at one and the same time. The verses of the song were so out of harmony that they could not have been just one voice. The mourning never stopped for day or night or for seasons or for breath. Each of the bright stars had their own ideas as to who or what it could be that was in such continued pain that they needed to make such a sorrowful lament to the night. Some thought that it was a lover who had lost a companion through war. It had to be someone that had suffered such a loss to justify making such a slow, sad song to the heavens. Others said that it must be the lament of a mother who knew that her sons and daughters were leaving her, never to return. Whatever it was, and whosoever it was, they could think or speak of nothing else. It was decided amongst them all to try and solve this puzzle, to bring an end to this mystery. They decided that it was their duty to the heavens to try and solve this puzzle once and for all time. If nothing else, they wanted peace of mind and a chance to think about something other than this terrible sorrow that fell onto their ears. But how could they stop in their slow twinkling travelling from one end of the universe to another to find out what had caused this suffering and still give light to the world? How were they to find the reason behind all of this sadness? They huddled together and spoke and raved, ranted and cried about what could be done and how they could stop this endless, sad singing. Without them knowing it, their whisperings, as they thought they were, their whisperings were no secret to anyone who cared to listen, for their voices were raised and their words were sharp for all to hear. And, as if in answer to their prayers, a comet, as light as the sun itself, with a great curiosity in its soul, had listened to all that they had discussed as it had darted through the heavens. Like some eager child, too willing to please, it spoke to the great council of stars. Let me go and find out. Let me go and find out. Please, let me. It would never have been so bold to talk to its betters, the stars, but it could tell by the desperation in their voices that they would listen now. Let me go. Let me go and find out. Let me. Its voice was not the most pleasant, and in the past it had good reason to know the sharp end of all of the stars' tongues when they considered it had come too close for their liking. Let me go and find out. Please, let me. Many of the stars felt irritated by their smaller cousin and had never shown the slightest interest in what he had to say. Many were irritated by the very fact that he had dared to speak to them without being asked. Please let me go. Please let me go and find out. Let me. I will find out for you, and I will be able to return and bring you news that will bring peace and sleep to your minds. The words gabbled out like a flowing torrent as it circled about the stars and repeated its request. It was the oldest of all of the stars that spoke first. All right. You can go, but you must bring the news straight to us, and do not tell anyone or anything else about what you find. Her voice echoed and rattled in that empty place. Oh, I will. You will not be sorry that you asked me. I will find out for you what has caused this great lament to fill the sky. I will find out for you all. Thank you. Some were vaguely amused by the antics of the comet, but others turned their backs to him and muttered darkly amongst themselves that he was no better than a child, and that it was a foolish king or queen who sent a fool on a king's errand. Remember, tell no one else about what you find. The words followed in the wake of the comet, for he had taken no time to think about waiting another moment longer in this place. It was with a renewed strength and purpose that the comet moved through the heavens, and now it had a reason to talk and interrupt anyone or anything that even vaguely crossed its path. Tell me, he would say, tell me now, tell me, his voice almost becoming as loud as the groan in the sky. Many had seen the comet as nothing more and nothing less than an irritation. Many had tried to ignore the noise that filled the darkness, and it was a great source of sorrow that, in his curiosity, he had awoken their own sadness and had ruined their own ability to ignore the dark song of the heavens. For those who would talk to him, they had theories and rumours, they had lies and conjectures, and each was more fanciful than the one before. But in all of this there was one thing that occurred and reoccurred. Everyone spoke in hushed tones of the planets themselves. He had noticed on his journey that the voices of the planets could be heard as he passed them. But the stories of the great bodies in the heavens was always of them being as one family, and it couldn't possibly be them that caused the great sorrow to be heard. More bold than he had ever been, the comet decided that he would give himself the courage to ask the nearest planet that he came to. After all, he had been to each of the corners of the universe and still had nothing to tell the stars. With nothing to tell the stars, then he would be a laughingstock to anyone who would be bothered to even glimpse his magnificent fiery trail through the sky. If I have nothing to tell them, then I might as well travel forever and never speak to another star for as long as I exist. He was trying to talk himself to having some courage inside of his heart. What could a planet do to me? What could they say that I have not already heard in abuse from the stars? He had in his sight the merest glimpse of a planet as it traversed the sky. He spoke again. "I will only talk for a short while, and I will allow the planet to talk. I will allow the planet to talk if they want to." He knew now that it was time for action and a time for self-control, courage and silence. He could see that the planet was small and swift, with wings at its feet and a message in its hand. He had to move swiftly to keep from crashing into the planet, but it had taken him so long to get to this place that he could not stop now. The heat of the sun scorched at his face and body, but he called above the roar of the flames, "My brother! My brother! My brother! I have travelled far, and I wish to know why there is a wailing in the sky." The figure before him did not stop for a moment, but angrily called over his shoulder, "Brother? Brother? You a comet? You have the audacity to call me brother?" For all there was anger in his voice, there were tears in his eyes as he went on his way. "I know only too well how the sorrow became, and there are many that will tell you it was me that was the start of it, but it was only in jest. And now I have to go and tell the others of my sadness and shame." The comet was intrigued and gratified that his journey had at least brought him an idea, or at least the start of an idea, from this fleet-footed planet's own lips. And if he knew something, then there was every chance that others may well know more. In trying to keep up with this planet so close to the sun, it had made him come too close to the sun's scorching rays, and his flesh was burnt, and his path was unsteady as he hurtled through the heavens. But as he cascaded through the nothingness, he thought that it would be worth the pain for the glory of telling the stars of what he had learned. It was almost without seeing that he came close to a woman as she cried and lamented. Her tears fell as rivers of minute glistening stars, and the comet could see that she was dressed in the brightest of robes that would have lit up any evening or morning sky. He felt compassion in his heart for her, and without thinking he blurted out, "My dear sweet lady." It surprised him how soft his own voice had become, and he could feel tears flow from his heart. "My dear sweet lady, what is it that makes you weep so?" He had almost forgotten that it was to find out why there was a sorrowful song in the cosmos that had caused him to travel so far. Her voice was as sweet as honey in the air. "Kind stranger, you do not need to weep for me. I have love inside of my heart, and a longing for my family to be as one once again, like it used to be. And you do not need to weep for me. It is for my family that I would wish to have by my side once more." The comet would have wanted to go around this planet again and again, but his course was still beyond his control as he careered onwards and into the darkness. He was glad to be away from the harsh rays of the sun, and he knew now that something had happened that had caused the planets to be so sad, so heartbroken. But he could only hope that his journey would give him all that he wished for. He was startled out of his thoughts when he heard another woman's voice, deeper and more grounded than that of the beautiful planet he had just left. She called out to him, "Do not be so frightened of me. I have many names. Some name me Gia, others call me Tellus. And at one time men thought that I was at the centre of the universe. I have that fool of a moon to look after. She hides from the sun and leads him a dance each and every day. They do not think that now. When I was happier, when I was seen as the most important of them all, which was only right and proper." The comet knew that his time to talk was short, and he did not want to interrupt the talk of the planet. But he shouted out to her, I have travelled across the galaxies to find out why there is such a terrible song in the air. I travelled to find the answer to the question I have been given by my masters, the stars." She smiled, but there was a tinge of sadness at the corner of her lips. "So, my fine friend, you want to find out why there is a lament in the sky? Then I will tell you. But you must listen, and listen carefully. At one time, we were as one, and then there was a foolish argument with the moon and the sun. I needed to help my soil become green, and he was wanting to find a way to get to her, and she had taken so much time to prepare him to find the answer that he was seeking, that her voice became fainter as she moved ever onwards through the darkness that swallowed him like a blanket. He was talking to himself as he streaked through the silence. So, there was an argument between them, and the moon needed the sun to keep his distance, and the beautiful planet wants only to keep her family close, and the planet of the seas and oceans wants...
Who is it who dares to come close to me without calling my name first?
The silence was slaughtered like a sacrificial lamb as the deep booming voice came from out of the cold void. Over his shoulder the comet could see a warrior in all of his armour, a sword at his side and a spear and a shield on his arms.
Well, what have you got to say for yourself?
The comet was terrified and trying to show that he was no threat to the planet by trying to turn to face to him.
You have no right to be in this place. I know only of fighting and war, and you have no right to be here. I know of only fighting and war, and you have no place or right to be here.
The comet felt a slow, cold pain in his back, and he could see that his blood had been spilled and had smeared the face of this frightful soldier.
Let that be a lesson and a warning to all of you lowly comets who dare to come close to my part of the sky.
There was no sad song upon his lips. His was a discordant voice that rattled and boomed through the night. As he sheathed his sword, the warrior was smiling with the drawing of the blood. The comet, its flesh burned, and now with a cut at his back, was glad that the warrior now looked like a distant memory, and he knew that the coolness of the night and the rays of the sun would help him to heal. As he slipped into sleep, he could see the messenger that had once been so close to the sun racing past, and muttering that he was sorry for all that he had done and said, and he wished that it could be as it had been. He clutched his arms about himself, almost holding his shame to his chest.
It was me that was the start of it, but it was only in jest.
comet drifted through the darkness. He could feel that the sun was helping to heal the wound at his back, and wondered at such a great star holding the ability to hurt and to cure. If it had been up to him, he would have laid the blame firmly at the warrior's feet. He was the worst voice that he had heard. His was the most terrible of actions. For all that he was tired, he felt as if he was getting closer to the truth of the lament, and knew that he would be welcomed at court to tell his story to the stars. It was as his thoughts drifted, and he muttered to himself, that he could feel a cooling hand upon his back. The voice was like a king's, and he felt cradled and loved in the arms of a king.
I can tell that you have travelled far, and I think that you have a question for me. You need to think carefully about what it is that you ask, and I will answer as best as I can.
The comet felt like a small child in the presence of this enormous king. As he looked at him, he could tell that he was only just smaller than the sun itself.
Your time with me is not long, and I need to make sure that the wind will blow and the snow will fall for my daughter Gia. So ask my small friend, and ask quickly, for I cannot keep you in my arms or by my side for long.
Your Majesty, I have only one question. Just one small question. I need to know, for the stars in the sky have sent me on this journey. I need to know where all of the terrible songs and laments come from. The songs that rob us of our sleep. The songs that creep into our minds and fill our hearts with sorrow. The king shook with rippled waves of laughter and smiled at the comet like a father glances at a favourite son.
It may only be one question, but it is the biggest of all questions that you have asked. I would fail you if I were to give you the answer without making you think for yourself. When you have come to your journey's end, then you will need to look back and reflect on what you have seen and what you have heard. Then you will have your answer.
The comet could feel the pull of his own momentum dragging him from the side of the king, and he couldn't help it, but he felt angry and disappointed that he had travelled so far and had only a riddle for an answer. He could hear the king hum deeply and darkly to himself. He could hear the king hum deeply and darkly to himself as he sped through the enveloping gloom on what seemed like a pointless quest. Each of the planets had their own story, and yet when he was young he had heard how they had all been as one family, old and young, men and women and children. But he had no time to think of that now, for he could hear a blade being sliced through the sky, and all of his thoughts returned to the sword's blow that had so recently left a scar at his back. He knew terror in his heart, and he made a monumental effort to turn and see his expected doom. Instead of an armed man, he saw that there was a man who, for all intents and purposes, looked just like the king he had just left. In his hand He had a huge, sharp, iron sickle. And instead of being dressed in the robes of a king, he was dressed in rags. He was slashing and cutting at the air and harvesting the corn that flew in the sooty murk about him. Running this way and that and dressed in stolen robes were his 20 servants who were telling him what to do. The comet could hear him screaming and wailing. "Before this time, our master was the king of all. Now master becomes servant, and servant does as he pleases." He pointed to one of his men, who was taking coins from out of his stolen robes. "You thief! You rob us all!" A worse picture of sorrow could not be thought of by man or beast, star or comet. If there had been some order to what the comet was looking at, he would have asked his question of the beleaguered king. But it did not look as if the king could breathe, never mind answer a question from the likes of him.
Do as you're told. Get over here.
Come here, you!
Do as you're told.
Come on, do my bidding!
And do it now, do it now, do it, do it,
Do it!
So now I know that I must think on all that I have seen. He recounted to himself all that he had seen on his journeys. There was a messenger who wished the blame upon the others. There was a woman bathed in sadness. He remembered the woman who needed the sun and hated having to hide the moon, for it stopped her thinking about the good earth beneath her feet. He winced as he reached to his back and remembered the sting of the sword. A warrior who knew the use of a blade, a great king who helped only to make me reflect on what I have seen, and a master who has turned a servant to his robbing companions. His head swam with a multitude of ideas, and he wished that he could make sense of all that he felt when he heard the slow and sonorous singing of 5 women. It would have been a joy to him if the song had been sweet and high, but the notes were deep and low and filled with sadness. The planet was decked with golden jewels, but there was no glimpse of a smile on his face. Even though he had 5 wives, there was no doubt that his heart was filled with sadness. After all of the careening about the universe, the comet had wanted answers to give to the stars, and all he found was sorrow and dissatisfaction. He felt as if he had no more heart to ask this man why he had no joy in his life. He would have liked to have travelled on his way with nothing more than a glimpse at his life and at his home. The air was cut asunder as he tried to sneak past this great planet. "Please, friend, please, at least speak to me." He looked at his wives. "Please, speak to us all. Why are you on this journey? What is it that you are seeking? What can we do to help you? For your face shows more sorrow than all of ours put together." The comet felt guilty that he had tried to sneak past these people. He could feel their dozen eyes plead to him and puncture his heart. Now it was his turn to know sadness. "I'm sorry. I am so sorry that I cannot stay, and so sorry that I tried to shun your company. I am on an errand for the stars, to find the source of all of the sorrow that we hear in the sky." All of them wailed. All of them wailed and reached their arms and thin fingers towards him as he slipped through the sky. "Our sorrows all started so many years ago. It was all that we can do to stop ourselves from weeping our lives away. You need to seek the oldest of us all. Your journey will not be long, and if you look back at all that you have seen and all that you have heard, then you will know why we are forced to lament." Their words had barely faded when there was a sting of salt in the air that caused the comet to blink and smart at its bitter spray. There was the rushing of the waves as he came closer to one of the planets that he had only heard of in children's stories and old men's tales. He was there for all to behold, but his briny skin and seaweed hair made him easy to miss in the darkness of the night. The comet felt frightened as he saw the great old man of the sea reach for him with his trident and net, and he thought that his end was near as he felt the rough rope against his flesh.
I am more used to catching fish, but a bright and...
Here he paused and almost smiled.
A bright and tired comet.
Any fear that the comet might have had was washed away by the tone of the old man's voice. There was no doubt that he was no stranger to sadness, but there was a calm, flat ring to his words as he spoke again.
Let me think. Let me guess. You have travelled a long way on a journey to find an answer to a question that was set by others too frightened to travel on the journey themselves.
The comet gasped at what the old man had to say and wondered if he was a soothsayer. He could hardly see for the salt in the air and had to shade his eyes as he looked towards his captor. I have to say that even though he was caught in the net, he still had no fear in his heart as he circled about the planet.
I can see that you think that I have the gift of second sight. But no, I have waited here at the edge of the universe for you to come close, and I have watched you as you have travelled.
He bent towards the comet and whispered so close to him that he could feel his salty breath upon his skin.
So let me ask you, what do you think of all of my family that you have met upon your way?
He held the comet in his steady gaze.
Be honest. What do you think of my family, with their fighting and their guilt, with their rushing and their messages of shame, with their servants as masters?
He looked at him again, only harder and more piercing, as if he were trying to gauge his thoughts. The silence of the cosmos cloaked them in its darkening shroud. It was only as the old man raised an impatient eyebrow that the comet spoke. I am not sure what to think or to say. I have never met anyone or anything that has given me so much to speak of, so much that I have learned, and so much I do not wish to tell, so much that I do not wish to tell in case it brings sorrow to them as it has brought sorrow to me. The old man smiled.
You were sent to find the source of the lamenting, and now you have found it. For you were told to turn and look at your journey, and now you must turn and look at where you have been.
As the planet spoke, he blew into the eyes of the comet and spun him around to look at the journey he had taken. The sun was only a tiny dot of light in the far distance, and now he could hardly see clearly, for the old man's breath had made his eyes sting. His aching eyes made a tear-filled covering to fight the effects of the salt in the planet's breath, and it made light reflect and dance. It made it look as if there were a great, flat, reflecting pool of water suspended in the darkness. His eyes clouded, and he could only try to look back at all of the planets, and all he could hear was the old man's voice.
What you will hear is what has been,
What you will see is all that has occurred. You have made a choice and you have made a journey, and now you will have to take the consequences of what you shall see. The comet could see the planets all walking and talking together. There was laughter in the air in this time, before this time. They walked together, they spoke together, they trod upon the same path together, and the songs that they sang were in harmony and beautiful to hear. The comet wondered why so much had changed and how they had all become so distant from one another. But before he could voice his questions, the image changed, and then he could see that one of the planets, the smallest and closest to the sun, decided that he would run on ahead. With wings on his feet, he could move faster than all of the rest. He could move and return almost as he pleased, and did not know the value of his own strength. His sister reached out her hands to implore him to stay, but in doing so, she moved away from the rest of the family. She did not have the swiftness of her younger brother, and she found herself drifting without the means to stay upon their one given road. The oldest of them all, too heavy and too old to change his ways, tried to keep up, but in his attempts to move, he too careered away from the road. He pushed into the wildest of them all, who drew his sword and threatened any man or woman who came into his path. This warrior tried to curb his wilder brother's taunts and jibes that he could never catch him, but by now it was too late. Where once they had been on a single path, where words could be spoken and faces could be seen to get their true meaning, they travelled in disarray, scattering to the heavens and moving away from one another through nothing more than a fancy by a foolish planet wishing to show off. Some meandered far away from the sun and knew only cold and ice. Others would bake, like Icarus's journey too close to the sun. The planets called out to one another as they passed by, and those that had anger in their hearts would curse and shout as their paths crossed. Misheard words and tokens of devotion became misunderstood and lost in the great vastness of the universe. Their shared song became forgotten with time, and the words and verses changed. Perhaps no more than a word here or a note there, as each travelled on their lonely journey, and what had once been harmony became discord. So let me ask you, comet could see it all now, and understood what it had been shown on its journey. The old man, close to him now, with the wisdom of age, could see that the comet had seen enough and freed him from his net. The water in the comet's eyes were not from the sting of the last of the planet's briny breath, but from sorrow that welled in its heart and flowed like a waterfall. Now it had the knowledge that it had been so eager to seek. Now it had everything that the stars had asked for. It knew the cause of the sorrow and the cause of the terrible lament that filled the night. It remembered the oldest star's words. Remember? Tell no one else about what you find. It knew that it could tell the stars, and it could travel to tell them all that it had found out on its long, arduous journey. it had obeyed the stars in every way. Not one word had been spoken to anyone or anything of what it had found out, but to have to tell them all that it had seen would have broken its own heart. The comet knew that it would bring no comfort to anyone or anything that heard the true cause of the sorrow and sadness. Without ever speaking again, it turned its back upon the stars and moved away from the planets. With the indifference of time, it was forgotten by the stars, as they would make their own reasons for the cause of the sad, slow songs in the night sky. They would often see the glimmer of a trail of light, but even this would still not cause them to remember a comet that had once been so eager to please and serve. To save them all, it locked the secret of the sadness that it knew inside of its own heart, and would travel silently and without a word or a glance to anyone, strong in the knowledge that it was saving anyone or anything from such a great sorrow by hiding, by bearing, by suffering it within its own heart, with a sad song and lament of its own. As the god of the sun rose and crept his way across the horizon to seek for his cold-eyed bride the moon, the farmer would curse the young cockerels that woke him. They had cuckala-cuckala-cooed their way through the night, each one calling louder than the other, each one cuckala-cuckala-cooing to get his attention, and he had tried his best to ignore them, but he knew better than to keep his cows, sheep and corn waiting, just waiting for him to arise late. In that place between sleeping and waking and dreaming, and safe in the warmth of his blankets, he could tell the hour of every day and every season, no matter how dark or how light it was. No matter what the season, he knew the hour, and he also knew when it was time to roll over and when it was time to get up and work. Now he was up, and he could tell by the smell of the air or the rustle of the trees, and he knew that he could have had a few more soft moments wrapped in the arms of his wife. In this entire world he did not really need a cockerel's crow to wake him, but he knew that if there were no cockerel, then there would be no peace in the coop, for the hens would cluck and cackle at one another, and peck and scratch at more than the ground. By the bleak light of the moon, by the harsh heat of the day, as the sun spread his fingers through the shade of the bushes and briars, they, the hens, would fight amongst themselves for the want of some comfort from a proud coxcombed king of the farm. He knew that if they weren't happy, then there would be no eggs to eat. Worst of all, there would be no eggs to put into the fine, heavy, honeyed cakes his wife would make for him. And if there was one thing that he liked better than anything than his wife's cake, then it was more cake. When he was sitting taking a rest in the shade of a crumbling wall, he would be licking at his fingers as the honey tried to escape his tongue. No greater pleasure in this hot and dry place could ever surpass cake. What they did have was not so much a king, not even a prince. A duke would have been ashamed to be linked to this excuse of a cockerel. He was the best that the farmer could buy. Actually, I tell you a lie when I say buy. He was given, almost as a joke, by the hen woman when she wanted to get rid of it. "He's yours for the price of a kiss," she had cackled when she handed over this poor specimen of a cockerel. "Just a little kiss. A peck on the cheek for the king of the hens." Her laughter was sweet to the old farmer, and the thought of brushing his lips against the smooth powdered cheek of the hen woman when his wife wasn't looking made his heart beat faster. In his time, the poor cockerel, who called the farmyard his kingdom, had been a good father to all of the chickens that scurried about in the dust of the farmyard. He had been a good husband to his great harem of hens. He was attentive and caring in the way that no haughty, broad-chested bantam would have taken the time to even think of. But now he was getting old. Now he was past what little best he had left in his bones and feathers. When he first arrived amongst the flurry of hens, they had been glad for his company, but now there were other, younger, stronger birds who were trying to impress, and succeeding. It was only by comparison with these growing birds that he seemed so far from what they wanted. He was good enough when there were no others, but surrounded by his younger, stronger offspring, he was not allowed to touch or preen those that had lusted for his company. In all of this sadness that he had always known, he had always looked to the farmer and watched and waited and remembered all of the jobs and tasks that he needed to do. What was even more important was the fact that he had learned the rhythm of the farmer's day. He had committed to his mind the flow of the seasons and the time of day that the farmer needed to be awoken. I would never be so foolish to say that the farmer liked to be awoken. This cockerel had a greater knowledge of what and how the farmer needed to organise than he had himself. Before the flock of his fine young sons would push him out of the way, the old one, for he was old now, the old one would wait until he knew what was the right time to wake the farmer before he would crow his distinctive "Ookala-cookala-crackala-coo." He would cry at just the right time. His was not the strongest of voices. His was not the deepest of voices. His was the voice that he had been given, and he tried his best to do what was needed of him, to call the farmer to wake. "Yookala-cackala-crackala-coo! Yookala-cookala-crackala-coo!" This was not the finest of voices, but it was enough to wake the farmer in as close to a good mood as was possible. "Yookala-cookala-crackala-coo!" he would cry. In the winter, it would still be dark when he crowed his call. In the summer, the sun would have arisen for hours before he would make his chanticleer call, always knowing that it was not the dawn's light that needed to be heeded to start a call for the farmer. I am not saying that the old man rose with happiness in his heart, and it wouldn't be the first time that a boot or a shoe or a chamber pot would be thrown out to get him to quieten his call. But the farmer knew that a call from this poor king of the coop meant that he had no choice but to get up. And even on the coldest of days, it would mean that there was always going to be honey cake for dinner. In some ways, they had become what some would call friends. The farmer would often curse the cockerel and place his huge, scratched, work-worn fingers into a heavy hammer of a fist and curse, "The pot's not too small for you, you spoiler of dreams." And of course the old cockerel knew that this was the time to hide under the dry, splintered boards of the farmhouse until the honey cake had had its effect. Sometimes the cockerel would wander away from the clucking of the hens, and the farmer would put a small, and I mean a small, piece of the cake down for him to share. The farmer's voice would be smooth with the honey at his throat. "You know, old friend," he would wipe the sticky crumbs from his chin and hand the scraps to his waiting tongue. "You know, old friend, you and I are so alike. I have my wife, and you have your wives. She is always calling me lazy, but I know that she likes me, I think that she loves me. You have all of the hens. You, who would have been in the pot 100 dawns ago if that hen woman hadn't given you to me. Given you to me for... He started to talk as if he were in a fine dream. If she hadn't have given you to me for the price of a kiss. From behind the hedge by the edge of the wall, a small, high, cackling laugh could be heard as that eavesdropper of a hen woman heard what he was saying. She was skipping out of sight before he had a chance to deny what he had said. He stood up, indignant and embarrassed, but secretly pleased that she had heard him, and he brushed the crumbs of cake from his shirt and returned to his plough. It is one thing to call when it is time to call, but it is another to know when to cease your crowing. If the cockerel could have spoken, he would have known that it was never the time to talk about the way that the farmer looked and thought about the hen woman. He knew it was his job to wake the farmer once. It was his job to make his noise once when the time was right, and at no other time. Yuckala-cuckala-crackala-coo! If only it had been so with all of his fine young sons. As they grew, they would watch him as he tried to teach them how to crow so that it was not too long, so that it was not too loud, so that it was not too high. He had the sense to go away from the farmyard and find a sheltered place and take them where they could not be heard with their practising. Sometimes, and this is a hurtful thing to say, his young sons would laugh at the way that he crowed in the morning. And this is an even worse thing to say, for those hens that had been glad of his company when they had no other, they would mutter amongst themselves out loud and in his hearing, that they had never thought that much about his crowing. The strength that we find in ourselves can be hard to find, but he would pay no heed to their bickering and try his best to teach his children well. Every time he would say to his young sons, "You must watch the farmer and wait until the right time to crow. It is not just the way of the sun and the moon. The sun chases his lover across the sky, and she fools him by making the day longer and shorter. Watch what the farmer does. Look to the earth to see what is needed. Think about all that you do." Yuckala-cuckala-crackala-coo. The young cockerels would look and listen to what he had to say, but they would not think about the meaning of his words. All they wanted was to be the loudest and best and first to crow. At night, as they lay in the soft straw at their mother's feet, they would listen to their mothers praising them for their bright red combs. Their doting mothers would proudly pull at their tail feathers and whisper in their ears that each one of them was better than their poor, raggedy father. "You are much stronger. You are so much better and more handsome than him. Soon you will be the pride of the farmyard. You will be the finest cockerel the farmer has ever seen." It is hard to disagree with someone when they shower praise on you. It is hard to hold reason close when all you can hear is how good and brilliant you are. It is harder still to listen to reason and practice what you truly know is the right thing when all you have is a diet of how you can do no wrong. All of the young cockerels would go out in the night and crow as and when and how they wanted. It didn't matter that it was midnight or midday to them. By the light of the dying sun they would crow, "Cuckala-cuckala-coo!" Each one, with their own mother's encouragement, would crow as if they had been the first to crow in all of the world. They all behaved as if they had invented the art of crowing. "Cuckala-cuckala-coo! Cuckala-cuckala-coo!" By the light of the stars and away from the house, and beyond being found out, they would "cock-a-doodle-doo!" At the edge of the forest and by the side of the wall, they would "cuckala-cuckala-coo!" And all of the while, the old one would hope that they would see reason and crow when it was the right time. And it happened like this. Even though the dawn was about to break and the sun was making ready to pursue his love again, the old one stood waiting by the farmer's open window. He knew that it was a good hour before it was time to crow, and as he waited he could just see from the corner of his eye, strutting towards him, he could see one of his sons. It was the tallest of all of the young cockerels, the one who had nodded the hardest when he had been given instruction by his father, the one who the old one had the greatest of love for and the greatest admiration for his sense and ability to do what was right. The old one tried to block his way as this young cockerel entered the farmyard as if it was his castle. But his mother was there by his side and scowled at the old one. "Oh, my son," he pleaded, ignoring the mother. "My son, wait another hour before it is time to wake the farmer." He was running by his son's side. "The old farmer doesn't need to be up. He has prepared the hay and the seed has been set. He made sure of that last night. At this time of year, he always wishes to lie a little longer in his bed." There was no talking to the young cockerel as his mother smoothed down his feathers as he pushed his own father to one side. "Out of my way, old man. It's now my turn to crow," the hen spoke.
"You've had your turn, and I'm not saying that we're ungrateful, but you need to be quiet and let a younger, stronger, better cockerel have his day."
The old cockerel was filled with fear and rage at his helplessness to get his son to listen to him. "The farmer will want to get up when he hears me." There was arrogance and knowing in his voice. The father spoke again. "Please don't do this. It's not the time. All you have to do is wait. Think. It is still too early." His words were drowned out as his son took a large breath, puffed out his chest, and let the air resound with a loud, magnificent cry. "Cackala, cackala, coo!" Everything that grew or flew, crept or crawled, suddenly went silent. The young cockerel smiled to himself, and perhaps he should have been satisfied with the startling effect he had had with his crowing. But sense and reason fly out of the window when pride is involved. He was disappointed that the farmer had not come out to congratulate him on his fine waking call, so he took another breath as the old one took shelter beneath the house. His mother looked about the throng that had gathered with a self-important look on her face as she beamed to the crowd. It was as if she was making this spectacle of herself instead of her son. "Cuckala, cuckala, coo! Cuckala, cuckala, coo! Cuckala, cuckala, coo!" This time there was a reaction from inside of the house. It wasn't a chair or a chamber pot, but the farmer himself, as he had his hands at his back as he adjusted his belt and shirt. He was walking slowly towards the bird and muttering and mumbling to himself. It was as he got to within an arm's length of the beaming, preening young cockerel that he spoke. "Did you do that?" In other circumstances he would not have believed that he was talking to the bird as he shooed its mother out of the way. "Was it you who woke me up? Was it? Please tell me." The young bird clucked again and took a breath. "Cuckala, cuckala, coo! Cuckala, cuckala, coo! Cuckala." But it was the last sound it made, for behind his back the farmer had a thin, silvery, sharp blade that, with one swift movement, had parted his strutting head from his proud body. Oh, the body kept on strutting, but the voice was silenced as the farmer went back to his bed, until it was the right time to go back to work. The farmer's wife took the cockerel and it made a fine stew for the tea, and you would think that such a terrible sight of the proud young cockerel would have given everyone a reason to be quiet. But none of it. It only seemed to make the mothers and their foolhardy sons crow the louder. All the while, the old one realised that nothing he could say would make a difference. He resigned himself to hide beneath the house until he would have his own turn to crow again at the right time. These foolish creatures would go on through the night with their practising crowing, and one terrible night time, when the farmer had been robbed of sleep for as long as he could remember, there was chicken stew on the table every night for a fortnight. If it wasn't the mothers, then it was the sons who kept on with their crowing. It wasn't as if they didn't know what the consequences were, for the air was always filled with the smell of chicken, and the cats always had bones and wings to chew on. The farmer's pillows were so full of fine young feathers that he would have slept well if it hadn't been for the last of all of the young cockerels. He was slyer and more cunning than the rest. He would make his practised chanticleer song away from the hearing of the farmer, and when he thought that the time was right for him to be the king of the farmyard, when he knew that his voice was the finest, then he waited for the old one to come from under the farmhouse and resume his waking of the farmer at the right time and at the right place in the day. He bided his time and watched and mimicked his father's call. He waited until the time was right. He would pretend to listen to his father, but in his evil heart he knew that when he had gotten rid of his father, then the farmer would wake up when he told him to, and at no other time. On that fateful morning, the sun had just arisen and was seeking to find some way to trap his love, the moon, when the old one stood on the top of the hay bales and waited until the shadow of the crooked elm touched the side of the barn. That was the right time at this season that the farmer wanted. No, at the time that he needed to get up. It would be some minutes before the shadow had taken its course, so he rested his head beneath his wing and waited until the appointed time. He had fallen into a calm sleep when he heard his own crowing rattling across the fences and walls of the farmyard. Yuckala-cuckala-crackala-coo! This was not the time. This was not his voice, because he'd been asleep. How could he have made the sound when he was asleep? It was then that he saw the last of all of his sons hiding in the cool shadow of the wall. He was flapping his wings in triumph, knowing full well that the farmer would be at his wit's end and ready to find someone or something to fill his pot. Once again the son mimicked his father, louder and stronger. Yuckala-cuckala-crackala-coo! Yuckala-crackala-cackala-coo! There was a curse and a rasp of a blade being sharpened, and before he had the time to get away or hide or crow that it was not him, the farmer had him by the neck, and he could see the blade, long, sharp, and well used. Was that you? I thought that I could trust you to keep me in bed until it was the right time for work, the true time for work. There was nothing but anger in his words. I thought you were my friend. You've always served me well, but if you cannot keep me in my bed, then you shall be the next to join me for my dinner. The knife was raised high in the air and dazzled the old one's eyes, and he resigned himself to die. He could hear the blade as it cut through the air, and he waited for his end to come, when just at the moment when he should have died, the last of his sons gave a great crow of triumph. Yuckala-cuckala-crackala-coo! 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 The farmer may have been old, and he may not have been as swift as he had been as a young man, but he could see and hear what had happened. He could see that this young cockerel was the one who had spoiled his sleep. He turned the blade towards this impostor, and before there was the time to breathe, its head was on the ground, and the body was rushing this way and that, in a scratching, soundless search for the head. The farmer stormed back into the house with the body beneath his strong arm. There was a rage upon his face and lips as he barked at his wife to heat up the oven. When he returned, he still had the knife in his hand. He looked at the old one. "And that's for you." He raised the newly cleaned blade. "And that's for you, my friend. I've only one thing for you. There was a glinting and a blinding shimmering of the steel blade. And as for you, I've only one thing for you. The blade was high above the old cockerel's head, and he watched it slice through the air and cut to the very heart of a round, sweet honey cake. And as for you, my friend, at least you know my ways and the times of the season, and here's something for you. The cake was placed on the ground, and the old one pecked at the generous crumbs that he had been given from the farmer's favourite cake. The two of them sat in the early morning sunshine, and marvelled at the way the sun played its game with the horizon, searching and seeking for its loved one, the loved one that it would never find, as she hid in the darkness of the night.